Hello, everybody. So happy to see you all, and so happy to host today's event, which is part of FestivalYA, FestivalYA, put together by Cărturești. I am Iulia Andrei, a marketer by day and literature enthusiast by night, and I work for Nemira Publishing House, which is where you can find the Romanian translation of the first book of the Talents trilogy, Ordinary Monsters. Here it is. This is it. And fun fact, the cover was picked by our lovely community of readers. And I am thrilled that we will learn more about the book and the universe from the author himself today, J.M Miro, which I thank for being with us. All the way from Canada, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct, yes.
So for us, the day is slowly ending. Well, for you, it's just begun.
Yes, it's
Thank
first thing in
you.
the morning.
Thank you for starting your day off with us, then. I will do a bit of housekeeping before we dive in. Everyone will get to ask their questions by raising their hand, either through the Zoom interactions or by actually raising the hand after turning their cameras on, or if you don't feel comfortable or cannot do that, you can write it in the chat. I know this is also being live streamed, so any questions that come from the live stream, yes, will be answered as well. And that's it. To get the ball rolling, I will ask a couple of questions of my own. First being that I know you are a poet first and a novelist second, if I can put it that way. So I was wondering how this transition felt from a more like a short form of writing to a more, let's say, expansive one, since the book is over 600 pages. I
Yes.
guess it's a big difference.
Um, well, that's a really good question. Poetry and fiction feel very different to me. I think it has something to do with what's being said. That's the subject matter at hand. I mean, I can't imagine writing Ordinary Monsters as a long poem. It just really would be very strange to do. I think that in poetry, what's being put forward first is the language and perhaps an idea. And I think of it a little bit as if there's a border on the page, and in poetry, it steps outside of that border constantly. It's striving to enter my own real life. Fiction is different. There's the border on the page, and the story exists inside the border. Um, the what's put forward first is the characters and the plot.
Mhm.
Uh, Sometimes I think of Ordinary Monsters as a feat of typing rather than a feat of writing because it was just so long. But it came very quickly. I was surprised at how quickly I wrote the book. I started writing it when the pandemic struck all those
Mhm.
years ago with COVID. And it was such a dark time. And I just thought, now's the moment to lean into writing something that would just simply bring me pleasure, something fun. And it was done by Christmas of that year. So it was about 8 or 9 months to write the book, which is very fast for me.
It also seems faster, seeing as it's again quite the book, but it also didn't feel hard to get through. I was really impressed by the pacing of it all and how this space to sort of linger on details and the atmosphere. And you mentioned characters. And one thing that I felt, and I then realized in our community of readers is also felt, is that characters are very well-rounded, and they all get this treatment, whether they stay with us in the story for long periods of time or they're sort of fleeting characters. And so my next question would be if it was character first and then story second, or story first, character second, or maybe sort of both ended up creating the story at the same time?
That's also a really good question. You know, I'm so sorry. I should have said, and I meant to say this, but I had so much trouble with my computer. I got flummoxed. But thank you all so much for hosting me and having me here and inviting me. I really wish this was in person so I could come to your beautiful part of the world. But I'm just absolutely thrilled to get to talk to all of you and answer any of your questions as best I can. Your question about what comes first. I think for me, it's generally a premise. I mean, it could be anything really, an image or a character or even a line of dialogue, but usually it's a premise. In this particular premise, we have two young children, my wife, and she's also a writer, an absolutely brilliant writer. And I was driving the children home from gymnastics, and I just had this idea of children with powers in Victorian England. And this was many years ago, maybe 10 years ago. And I just came home and I mentioned it to my wife offhand in the kitchen, and she said, "That's your next book. Write that one next." And it took me a little while to get to the point where I could, but that's kind of where it came from, was just sort of the premise. But the first thing that I ever had for the book was a character. It was the character of Alice Quick, who's a female ex-Pinkerton detective. And I'd written an earlier novel, not speculative or SFF, just a historical novel about the Pinkertons. And one of the details that I found most interesting and shocking was this detail about the female detectives that they had working for them. Alan Pinkerton, who founded this famous detective agency, he was a very interesting Scottish immigrant to the US, and he hired women to go undercover for him. And his most trusted agent of every detective that he had was a female agent. And then when he died and his two sons took over the business, the first thing they did was relegate all those agents to desk work. They took them out of the field. They said it's not appropriate for women to be doing this work, even though they were so good at it. You can't do it. And I loved that, the tension of that, and thinking about these extraordinary, capable women who had been doing this very dangerous work for so long, suddenly being told by these young sons of their boss, you shouldn't be doing this work, and losing their employment. And so I wanted to write that character, and she didn't fit into the earlier book. So she existed kind of always in the back of my mind as a character I wanted to write. So when this story started being told, she kind of muscled her way in and insisted on being in it.
And then she became quite an important part of it. So I'm very, very glad for her existence, because I know she is a beloved character in the story. When I talk about the book with others, you mentioned another book, and I wanted to let people know who might not know that Ordinary Monsters is written under pseudonym. And my question would be how that came to be. And it sort of relates to my first question, if it has anything to do with sort of separating the poet from the novelist at all.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So my other name, most days of the week, I go by the name Stephen Price. And in Canada, I'm known as a poet and a novelist. And I have 3 novels as Stephen Price and 2 collections of poetry. When I sat down to write this, the origins of my desire to be a writer, where it all came from, is I was a very lonely 10, 11-year-old boy. I didn't have friends. I was picked on, bullied a lot. And I found refuge in reading. And the stories that I was reading were fantasy stories. Now, this was a long time ago, so the books that I could read were Terry Brooks, Robert Jordan, Tad Williams, Ursula K. Le Guin changed my life, just absolutely exquisite, and of course Tolkien. And these were the kind of books that I hid inside, and I read them as a young boy, and I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to do this too. I want to write these kinds of stories. And then I grew up, and life changes you, and you change with it. And I continued with this dream to be a writer, but I was seduced into poetry by some wonderful teachers. And then I leaned into a different kind of fiction, but I never stopped reading those kinds of books, just sort of as comfort reads. It was different from the work that I was producing, but it was always kind of there in the back of my mind. And then when I sat down, when COVID struck and the whole world shut down, and it was just my small family living together on the coast of Canada here, I kind of, everything seemed so dark and bleak, and it was such a sad time. And I just sat down and I started writing this story that I've been thinking about for a long time, since I talked to my wife about it, and these books that I would read when I wanted to just read for myself. Uh, and I just started writing this story that just kept going and going. And, it just didn't stop. When it was done, I was left with a manuscript where the sentences still feel very much like Stephen Price, but the story being told is so completely different from the other kinds of stories I'd told that I didn't know what to do with it. And I sent it to my agent in New York, and we had a good conversation about it. And she said, look, I'm happy to send it out however you want, no pressure, whatever you want to do. And I talked to my wife and I thought about it. And at the end, I decided that the best thing to do would be to put it out under a different name so that people didn't think it was going to be like my other books and be disappointed, but not to make a big secret about it. Now, the strange thing is when it finally was published, the reviewers in North America and in Britain and the UK, a lot of people were treating it as if it was supposed to be a secret. So it was very awkward. There were questions on the internet about who is J.M Miro, and I mean, I would just say I'm me. I'm over here, Stephen Price. So I wasn't trying to keep a secret. But yeah, that's where it came from.
Well, those were my questions. I mean, I have a lot, but I wanted to open up the floor to any questions from anyone here, if there are any, from the meeting itself, or if not, I have lots of them. So I will. Oh, you have a question? Go on. We have a question.
An observation first, and then a question regarding Alice. And when I read, or when I started reading, the images in my brain were very much sketch-wise and sketch-like. I didn't really see the characters. Then they became more anime-like. And it was the first time when Alice showed up that it really became like a movie. It what brought the color and everything else in it. So I'm very happy for her. As for a question, since you mentioned poetry and that you were like pushed and invited into this world of poetry, what are other poets that you feel like it inspired you to step in and stay there?
Oh, other poets that, well, I love this question. Thank you. In Canada, there's a couple of poets here that I wish were better known outside of our borders. Patrick Lane is one of them. Lorna Crozier is another one. Absolutely beautiful poets. In America, in the U.S., I've read a lot of Charles Wright, Robert Hass, Sharon Olds, um, Heather McHugh. These poets are very important to me. Poets in translation, um, probably the one that's mattered the most to me is Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet. and Zbigniew Herbert, and I'm probably mispronouncing their names horribly, and I apologize. Now, it's hard to know with the translation, poets in translation, what I'm actually reading. You know, there's language is such an integral part of poetry. So what I'm responding to, and I'm aware of that, is the translator's interpretation and version of what they've produced in their native tongue. But with Miłosz, at least, he was working with Robert Hass in a lot of his English translations and approving them, and he was fluent in the language. So at the very least, he was acknowledging that they were acceptable. But they're certainly the poets that mattered the most to me. I don't know a lot of Romanian poets, unfortunately. Are there any that you would recommend that I should try to track down?
Mariuka, do you want to give a recommendation?
Sadly, I don't read Romanian poets. I usually
Oh,
read foreign poets as well. So the only Romanian poets I read or read are the ones that we had to read for school.
oh
And now I'm
dear.
exposing myself very much. But yes, I think Roxy is more in, I think, the one that reads more in the more contemporary side of poetry rather than me, who is still in the school noted poetry.
I don't know if it's the same in Romania. Here in Canada, in school, we start by studying old dead poets, usually old dead white men. Yeah, so you know, for us, it'll be Shakespeare or Shelley or Byron or Tennyson, and it's a terrible way to introduce any young person to poetry. I think you should begin by reading the poets who are writing right now in the language that we all use, and it tends to be a lot more direct and forceful and moving. And I feel like certainly in my experience, young people are looking for that, and they'll often hold up lyrics to songs and say, look at this beautiful poetry. And what they're looking for is just something that makes some kind of sense. You know, because poetry is not supposed to be something where there's a code or it's a puzzle to be sorted and figured out. It's supposed to move you, you know, create an epiphany. So I think that's a real shame. And then you should work your way as you get more and more sophisticated with your poetry. You should work your way slowly backwards, you know, so that you're finally ready to read, say, poets from 200 years ago, rather than starting with them. That has nothing to do.
My favorite poet, so to say, is Yeats, William Butler Yeats.
Oh, yes.
And yes, and mostly because usually it feels like a spell when I read it, which is why I prefer poetry with rhyme. I love that feeling of like I'm casting a spell as I say it, which is why I always give to the older side of poetry.
Yeah, Yeats is
And
beautiful. Do you read him in the English, of course? Yeah. Robert Frost has the same kind of rhythms, and he can vary his rhymes so beautifully, like Yeats. If you ever, if you sidestep his three extremely famous ones, and you just start reading his poems, they have the same kind of incantatory music as Yeats. Yeats is one of my favorites.
I have one little comment on this whole poetry kind of road we've gone down on, that I agree that it's not the best introduction to poetry to first read dead white men who wrote poetry. But the way I kind of experienced it at through high school and then especially at university, was that it sort of taught you, I don't know, like rigidity in poetry. And then as you like advanced and sort of moved into modern times and read contemporary literature and poetry, it was a sort of breaking of the rules that I felt. And it was quite beautiful in that way. So after all those years of sort of learning how it's meant to be, you stumble upon all these poets who like throw everything out the door and then shock you and surprise you with the content, but also with the way it's written.
That's very true.
All bad.
No, no, that's nice. It's kind of like that education mirrors what poetry itself was doing across those years. Yeah.
And we also have a question in the chat that is related to Ordinary Monsters. Were there any literary and non-literary influences that particularly shaped the narrative of the novel?
Yes, that's the short answer. Huh. And what were they? I suppose.
Yes, I assume
that's a really good question. There are always every book I think that every writer produces, and certainly for me, everyone that I've ever done is on some level deeply personal. So Ordinary Monsters is a strange conflagration between me writing towards the boy that I was, that 11-year-old lonely boy who had no friends and couldn't really see that his life was going to get any better, that things were going to improve, and that there would be a way out. And at the same time, it's me writing about my own kids and who they are and what they're going through. And it sounds very strange to say that because it's set in the 19th century and these children have unusual powers and they're hunted by a man of smoke and so on and so forth. So it doesn't sound very autobiographical. And I assure you it's not in that respect. But I do recall that boy, that 11-year-old boy that I was, and I look at him like he's a different person, really, because it's been so long and so much has changed. The place where he found his refuge that he hid inside were books. He read, he found his friendships in books. And at the same time, by burying my nose in books, that was part of what I was teased about and picked on and bullied and pushed around for. And part of what I wanted to explore was this idea that what appears to make us different or strange, what appears to separate us and make us vulnerable, is often where the source of our strength and power lies in life. And it's those differences that are so important. They don't only just make you, but they are also the wellspring for the strength that you'll draw upon later in life. And I wanted to play with that idea. So I wrote about these children, mostly children, who were vulnerable, were the picked upon, the tossed aside in the world. And I said it in the 19th century because it seems to me in my research and knowledge and awareness that was the cruelest century to children. It was this early industrial era when human life was very cheap, and we were just learning to replace some of the human labor with machine labor, but that just made the human labor worthless, not of greater value, but of less. So I put the children in that time, and then I selected children. I started writing about children that either reflected aspects of my own childhood or my children's. So Charlie, for instance, is half Black. My children are half Black. And of course, being a racialized person in the 19th century is an extraordinarily dangerous identity to have. Marlowe's a little bit different. He's a little something slightly different, but Ribs, for instance, is a street kid, an urchin. There's an early encounter with other street kids in London. So I wanted to take all these kind of children who were very, very vulnerable, and then the things that often are the source of their pain, of their hurt, would turn out to be linked to their power. So Charlie, being a racialized boy in the Deep South, is physically abused, but his power, of course, is to heal. Ribs, who's a street person, a kid growing up on the street with no protection, is exactly the kind of person people would walk past and never see, and her ability is to turn invisible, and on and on and on like that. So part of the whole project was to take this childhood that I'd experienced, and not to go into any detail, but that I see with my own children in various ways, and shift it into the realm of metaphor, and then write about it directly. So that would be the non-literary influence. The literary influence, I would have to go back to just a couple of writers that I really love, but most importantly, Ursula K. Le Guin and her Wizard of Earthsea series, the Earthsea books. And you won't see a direct link in the two imagined worlds between those stories. But what you will see is, I hope, an attention to the idea that a story can be bigger than itself, and that every sentence matters when you sit down and you write your stories. And I feel that I learned so much from Le Guin's books about life as well as writing, but certainly about writing. Thank you for the question.
And her books are also translated into Romanian at Nemira. So your book here has a great neighbors and great friends on our shelves. And actually, while you were telling all of this, I have another question. Another question popped to mind. Seeing as there's this very sort of personal influence and inspiration that led to the creation of all the characters, how did you end up deciding what point of view to write from? Because the book switches, and you have moments where you get scenes that almost like 360, not to go into too much, but I feel like it's a hard thing, especially since it's so personal, that how do you decide whose perspective to go to?
That's a very, very good question. Sometimes the story tells you whose perspective you need to follow. So if something important is happening to a character, for their own story, their own journey, you'll know you'll want to be with them through that moment. And then there are other times when, say, for instance, I'm writing an extended, what I think of as my action scenes. So for instance, there's a early on sequence on a train.
Yeah.
And something like that is a little trickier, where I want to shift the points of view a little more quickly in order to give sort of the feel of a moving camera in cinema, like a long quick camera, and then sort of these jump takes in between. And that was tricky. I actually, for that train sequence, and I won't give any spoilers, but I actually I had to make a physical game board and put little pieces and move them around in sequence in order to make sure that I was following the right character at the right moment. It was a very complicated one. A lot of trial and error. That's the answer to that question.
We have, okay, I'll go in the order that we're posted in, but we'll be returning to this story in a bit. There is a question from Instagram that goes, the Victorian setting is rich and atmospheric. Did you face any challenges in blending historical elements with supernatural ones? And how do you decide when to stick closely to historical accuracy and when to take artistic liberties, especially when blending history with supernatural elements?
Well, thank you. That's a really tough one. I struggled. I tried to write this book several times over the years before I sat down. And I struggled to find the right tone, the right approach. I think part of the problem was blending that historical, that real world element in these fantastical abilities, these talents. And in the end, I think what made the difference, what made it possible to move ahead was, I mean, my version of the Victorian world, while I've struggled to be historically accurate, is very much an imagined one. It's very stylized. And when I realized that, you know, I'm writing about these, say, cobblestoned alleys in London with fog seeping through, and you know, when I realized that I'm creating that it's not the real place, it's my version of the place. It's almost like it allowed me to, it gave me the permission in my imagination to imagine the fog taking the shape of a person, and that person stepping into, you know, into the light. It's very hard to explain, but it ceased to feel like I was attaching one thing on top of another, and it's more like they were all of a piece. So I think it's a kind of organic, instinctive thing that happens for a writer. And you know, I don't really have a lot of like a secret for it. I'm sorry, like a recipe or a solution. Just you keep struggling until you find the right angle of approach or something where you're treating the material all on the same level, all as if it's one thing. As for the blending of, say, historical fact and fiction, I've always felt that histories they're simply the stories that we're currently telling ourselves about the past. It's not what really happened. It's our story about what really happened. And there are lots of conflicting stories about what happened. And if you start picking up out of print books about the past, they're telling a version of the past that we no longer tell ourselves. And once you start to realize how unreliable history is, you begin to realize that there's a lot of cracks, there's a lot of darkness in that story where you can pry the story apart, our version of what happened, and there's this great unknown in there, and you can easily step into that gap, the blank there, and fill in that gap in what seems like a plausible way. In other words, you just start telling the parts of the story that the histories are leaving out. I don't know if that answers the question, and I apologize if it didn't.
I feel like it did.
Cool.
I did say that we would be going back to the way that point of view and different points of view are used in the story. And the next question is, which point of view was easier to write, and which did you enjoy writing more?
Oh, yes. Well, oh gosh. Well, the point of view that was easiest to write was Alice. She was already a character in my mind, and she knew what she wanted. The most difficult character to write was probably Ribs, but she was also the one that I liked the most. Every time she would show up in a scene or on a page, she would kind of take over the scene. Uh, um, and that was always wonderful, but frustrating because I was trying to get to a different place and she would just get in the way with her quips and wanting to do something different. Yeah, I loved her very much, even while I wanted her to leave the room, please.
Um, and since you talked about characters in this way, it's always something I personally fell to in any of my creative writing classes, that once you start writing a story, especially when the character is already so clear in your mind, it's not the author or the writer sort of deciding a point. It's the character itself sort of doing whatever. And I feel like you might relate. This isn't necessarily a, a long-winded question, but it just it felt like I related to the way you talked about ribs and characters in general.
It's funny, it's strange, isn't it? They have this autonomy all on their own. It does feel like you're not creating a story, but discovering it, excavating it, that it's already there. And I mean, I often just say, my books are a lot smarter than I am. They know a lot more about what they want to be than I know about them. And part of my job as I begin writing the stories is to listen, to pay a lot of attention to what the story is doing and where it's making connections, and try to follow those and hear those, and uh, uh, be as honest as I can with the story itself. It's a peculiar experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I do agree. And then there's another question that sort of moves away from ordinary monsters. And the question is about the second book in the trilogy, which will be out very soon. And can you give us a spoiler for it or any information? Oh my God, it's already, yeah.
Out in English. Can I? Oh gosh. Well, a spoiler or any information. I could read you the dust flap. I'm not sure what would you like me to do that? Do you guys have
Yeah.
a description of it? Or okay. With the Orsine destroyed, Carindale lies in ruins, and Marlowe has vanished. His only hope of rescue lies in a fabled second Orsine, long hidden, thought lost, which might not even exist. But when a body is discovered in the shadow of Carindale, wreathed in the corrupted dust of the Druger, Charlie and the Talents realize there is even more at stake than they'd feared. For a new Druger has arisen, ferocious, horned, seemingly able to move in their world at will. And it is not alone. A malevolent figure, known only as the Abbess, desires the dust for her own ends. And deep in the world of the dead, a terrible evil stirs, an evil that the corrupted dust just might hold the secret to reviving or destroying forever. There you go. I don't know. I think they make it sound better than I can make it sound.
It's what we do in the marketing side of things.
And thank you for it.
There is another question, and we're moving back to ordinary monsters. From the excitement, we're leaving it a bit to the side. How did you decide that the title will be Ordinary Monsters? Did you have any other options that you didn't use? Question mark. I read that as a sentence.
Yes. Well, titles are really hard for me. Some people, they just seem to roll them off, but either a title comes quickly or it doesn't come. The Ordinary Monsters came very quickly. Before I'd even written the book, I had the title. And I was just grateful for that. In some ways, I found myself every time I would write a new part of the story, and I would encounter something that was echoed in that idea, that phrase, Ordinary Monsters, and I would think, okay, this title really is going to work. This works. And that was kind of always that would be a happy moment. But the title came quickly. Where did it come from? I have no idea. If I knew, I'd be able to title all of my books quickly and easily, but yeah, no, it was a bit of a mystery. I do know that the title for the series, The Talents, we had a different title, and I was writing very happily, right up very close to the point of publication, under a different title for the series, and then a very wonderful, helpful person at the publishing house in New York Googled and said, we've got a problem. There's another series out there with the same title. So then at the last minute, we had to come up with a different title.
well, it works really well as a it has a, you know, it sounds really good as the Talents trilogy. Um, and I have another question, but I will ask mine first because I can. Um, and my question, since you mentioned the series, is if you envisioned the story from the beginning as a three sort of part series, or if it just happened um, to end up like that.
Yeah, it was always a big I didn't think it would be quite as big a story as it is. And I think that's in part due to the points of view. You know, I wanted all these characters to have a chance to have their own voices, and that expands the story dramatically. But I always knew it was going to be a bigger story. I mean, there are several templates that I've been working with, and some of them I won't talk too much about because there are a couple more books coming for you guys. But I did know one of the templates that I knew that I wanted to play with was the myth of Orpheus, the story of Orpheus, um, and uh, and so I knew that there would be an entry into an underworld, a land of the dead, and I knew that there would be uh, a journey out of the land of the dead. And one of the things that this middle book in the series, Bringer of Dust, which will be coming shortly for you guys, does is it advances that story significantly. Knowing that, I knew that the story would fall into three parts, and that three books would be the natural way to tell it.
um, we'll move on to the actual question that was coming up and not my own. The book has an almost cinematic quality to it. Did you visualize scenes as you wrote them?
Yes, thank you. I'm a very visual writer. I don't know why, but I don't have much of a sense of smell, and therefore my sense of taste is limited as well. So I've just got touch and sound, and my hearing is going and my eyesight's going. So really soon it'll just be tactile images. But right now I'm a very visual writer. So the fact that you would describe it as cinematic is a great compliment to me. I love cinema, love film, and when I tell a story, it's very much playing out in my head. Yeah.
We have more of a recommendation for music. Since you mentioned Orpheus, I recommend a musical, Hadestown. Maybe the songs will be an inspirational soundtrack for your next project.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Thank you.
And since we are on the subject of the book feeling cinematic, have you ever sort of imagined it being adapted into any visual media of any sort? Because I also found the way everything was described, like how we always have a bit of time to sort of look around and visualize all the scenes and all the characters and, you know, just the atmosphere of it all would make for greater either cinema or a series on TV of some sort.
Oh, well, thank you. It would be difficult, I think, to turn it into a movie. I think that short stories work really well as movies, just structurally, the way that they move. Um, in movies, I don't think have a lot of, there's not a lot of space, in 2 hours. So probably it would need to be something more like a long form television. Um, I mean, all of these properties, like it's been optioned, but like so many book properties, you know, our work gets optioned and then it sits there and who knows if it'll get developed or not developed. I think it would, I mean, I think it would be a pretty interesting show to watch. But you know, it depends on the folks out in LA what they think.
I mean, fingers crossed, because I think it would be an interesting show to watch too. And there is one more question, which is sort of a 3-in-1. What has been the book's reception like for you? Have the book readers' interpretations surprised you? And was there a memorable reaction from them?
These are really good questions. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Well, the book's reception has been lovely. I felt, I mean, I was a little nervous putting the book out. I didn't know how it would go, and I found readers to be incredibly generous and friendly and warm. And that's been really lovely. Meeting other writers as you travel around has been also absolutely wonderful. I think there's just a really welcoming, a positive community surrounding SFF books, speculative fiction, that's really rare, I think, in this world right now. And it's been really it's really something to experience and to feel. Now I'm losing the other two questions. One of them was there a particular reader's reaction that surprised me? Probably the one that most surprised me was my agent in New York, who, you know, when I sent her the book, she was used to completely different kinds of writing from me, but and she does not represent these kinds of books at all, uh, or mostly not. But she read it in 3 days, and she called me up, and she was absolutely delighted with it. And it was her enthusiasm that really made me think maybe there's a book worth publishing here. Yeah. So that was really nice.
And again, since we've gone into, oh, actually, we just got a question. Okay, so mine will be left for later. If you could write one of the books you love, what book is it going to be, and what would you change?
Oh, wow. Well, if it's one of the books I love, I wouldn't change anything. If I could write, I mean, oh, we writers can be terrible, jealous, covetous, envious creatures when we read books that are just beautiful. I don't know that I would ever want to write somebody else's book. The books that matter the most to me feel like gifts to me, and I like knowing that the person who wrote that book is out there in the world somewhere, or was once out there in the world somewhere. That there was somebody that I could have sat down with at some point, and if we could have ever had a genuine conversation, that I would have felt that there's a kindred spirit in the world. So I don't know that I'd ever want to, but if I could, I mean, oh, there are so many books. I don't know. I think maybe I would wish to have written the first page of All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy, just the first page. I mean, the book itself is wonderful, but the first page, or maybe I'd love to have written Ursula K. Le Guin's A Wizard of Earthsea, which truly changed my life. But I mean, you could you could go back forever. The complete works of Shakespeare. Okay.
Yeah.
That, you know, the Iliad. Okay, I'll put that. So I don't know. What a question. What a great question.
But you sort of talked about jealousy amongst writers, but also the community. And I know your wife is also a creative person who writes. So how is it sort of, you know, living with someone who also writes? Do you influence each other? Which, I mean, I imagine you do. and just how is it always, you know, being in a creative space and having someone to share it with who like understands.
Well, it's wonderful. I mean, it's just, for us, it's just daily life, right? It's just life. But my wife, Essie, who's a brilliant writer, very successful, brilliant novelist. You know, we met when I was 21 and she was 19, and we've been together ever since. So, I mean, it's been a long time, decades and decades. So we kind of grew up together in some ways through our 20s, and we were struggling writers together, and you know, we sort of had early successes and many disappointments and heartbreaks. We're each other's first readers. We brainstorm ideas with each other. We are constantly talking about our projects together, passing books back and forth that we've read that we think are marvelous. It's a little bit like living with your creative other, um, which is, it's just great. There's this sort of, you know, we often get asked this question about, you know, do you feel competitive with each other? Is there envy and that sort of thing? Or, you know, but it's not really like that. It's like, you know, having a best friend, and when you've seen them, you know, have heartbreak and disappointment and struggle, and you see how hard they work for something, and it doesn't, you know, it doesn't pan out. All you want is you want it to pan out for them. You want it to work out. And when they have a victory or a win, or something works out, or then all you feel is joy and relief. So it doesn't really, it's really just it's probably like any other relationship. Um, Except in this case, what it hinges on is writing and creation. Um, yeah. But it's lovely. I mean, I wouldn't have the books I have if Essie weren't in my life reading them. And I mean, this particular book, for instance, wouldn't exist at all if she hadn't been in the kitchen that day and said, "That one, write that one." So,
True.
so I owe her everything. Yeah.
And as a last question, since I am aware of the time, I promise. What message or feeling do you hope people sort of take away from Ordinary Monsters? As in, if there's one thing that you want them to remember about the book, what would it be?
Oh gosh. Well, you know what? And it sounds strange to say it, because I know that there's darkness, and it dances along this edge of horror, and it's very much a dark fantasy. But at the core of this book, I think of it as an attempt to reach across 45 years, to take that little boy that I was, and just, you know, give him a great big hug and say, listen, just hang in there, be you, it'll get better. And, you know, your people are out there, you know, just hold on. And, you know, if anyone takes anything away from this book, I hope that at the core, you know, when you can get through all of the darkness and the struggle, at the heart of this book, I feel like there's that message to all of these kids in the book. Like, just hang on, believe in yourself, you know, embrace what you are, you know, what you are is worthwhile. And I hope that readers would take that same message away. Yeah.
I mean, um, even with the title, you sort of take that away.
Thank you. Yes.
Oh my God, I feel like now I should also have a heart.
Oh,
Go. Um, I don't know if there is time for like one more, or if we should end it here. Yes, no, maybe so.
well, I'd like to say thank you to everybody for showing up and for your wonderful questions. And thank you so much for hosting this, and everybody who put this on. It's absolutely lovely. As I said, I only wish it was in person so that we could all see each other face to face.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you. Especially since you started your day with this. So I hope it gave a good vibe and then set the day up for success until the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.